Today, have we reached peak madness yet? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analysis. We've noticed posts covering finance and property news. It's Friday, and I'm pleased to say that Tarric is back for another chat. Hi, Tarric. How are you going?
You're not bad, mate. Just recovering from the Trump versus Biden debate and just, trying to just wonder how we got here.
Well, I have to say, I saw one comment saying that the debate was an old man versus a con man. So I thought that was quite a good summary.
Oh, Lordy. Well, I will say it's been amazing to see how quickly people have turned on old Joe Biden and just saying, well, we need a different candidate. We need someone else who's going to actually be all there. So, it's really going to be open. It really could be open season now. So, we've only got what less than 5 months. Oh, yeah, almost 4 months till the election, and everything could be well and truly up in the air.
Absolutely. Well, it is quite fascinating, and there's a level of madness around the place more generally. I think we've got an election here in the UK at the moment, and Rishi Sunak, who basically I think picked the wrong time to go to the election because he was worried about what happened down the road with inflation and with some of the migration statistics. But he's been caught out left, right, and centre. The other side of politics here, of course, in the UK is trying to hold that Ming vase and not drop it, because they've got quite a big lead. But in doing so, they're doing all sorts of weird things. Neither side of politics in the UK are tackling the fact that there's a huge structural deficit wired in over the next 5 years. They're just playing around the edge. In Australia, of course, we've got the current shenanigans relating to the energy and inflation issues in Australia too. And, over in New Zealand, they've got some of the highest interest rates and a recession. You can't make this stuff up, can you?
No, it's really quite wild, isn't it? Just everything. And I think one of the things that's the most interesting is just how quickly we've seen things swing around. Like I was looking at some polling from Resolve recently, and as late as, sort of like September, October last year, Labour was seen as superior economic managers to the Liberal Party, and things were sort of, people still thought that things would bounce back and roughly go in the right direction. And now, after almost another year now, it's very, very different to that. And a lot of people are getting quite fed up with where the economy is going in Australia, which is, in headline terms, basically nowhere. And for everyone else, we're on the longest one of the longest recessions in individual terms on record, depending on your metric. In some, we are in the longest recession. So it's certainly interesting to say the least.
Well, I'm quite interested by the reaction to the CPI data that came out, and we'll probably touch on this in more detail. But just to see the herd of economists all saying, "Oh, rates are going to have to go up now," and some have been holding to that view, like Warren Hogan, for quite some time. But many others were expecting rate cuts. Just remind everybody, earlier in the year, people were expecting significant rate cuts around the world. Then it's not happening at the moment. Inflation still remains sticky. It's worth also thinking about this. The current rate of cash in Australia at 4.35%, right, is way lower than in the UK at 5.25%. And now people in the UK are saying, well, we might get one or two drops this year, so let's say 4.75%. The fact is that rates in Australia have been consistently lower than in many other places. And I think that's one of the reasons why the inflation problem is still with us. And I agree that not just one reading is going to actually determine what happens, but the overall volume of information and the structure of what's going on is not good. And I'd also highlight the energy stuff, right? Prices strongly up again. And whilst there is some relief, both from the tax cuts and from the money being paid out for those with energy bills, those are temporary. And of course, the RBA will look past temporary. So, yeah, very interesting. And I think there's more to play here.
I think that's going to be really quite interesting because from sort of Q3 this year onwards, things are going to be a mess in terms of the inflation data because we are going to see, like ANZ had some estimates, I think it was yesterday, saying that it's going to reduce headline inflation between the impact of the WA, Queensland, and federal energy subsidies are going to reduce headline inflation by about 0.7%. So, we could be, and probably will be, looking at a sub 3% headline inflation reading by year's end, but it won't be real.
Yeah.
And ANZ also estimate that inflation is going to go back up to about 3.4% once the subsidies end. So that has basically baked in the idea that headline inflation is going to be above 3% over a year from now, which is crazy. Yet, so the question is what does the RBA do? Do they just, do they actually sort of very, laser focus on their job and go, well, the trimmed mean, which is our preferred metric, is not doing what it's meant to be doing, so we're going to raise rates? Or are they just going to look at things and go, well, we've got a bit of cover now from these subsidies and this distortion in the CPI, so we're going to give it another quarter, maybe two, and then see what happens before we pull the trigger on a rate cut or a rate rise? And to be completely honest with you, that's the sort of direction that I think that they're leaning in because, some of the recent comments from the new deputy governor, I kind of get the feeling that they're going to want something more concrete than even one quarterly print going quite badly. I think they're going to want more than that. And and as I say, when the next quarterly print comes along, it's going to show this big, big drop in inflation because of the impact of the government subsidies. So it's really just a matter of how they choose to see it. And that could be, quite a wide range of different perspectives.
Well, let me throw something else into the mix. I get a bit of a whiff of an early election in all of this. Because if you think about where things are and where things could perhaps go to, an election towards the second half of this year would actually be probably the peak drop in inflation. And it's a bit like what Rishi did in the UK, because of course things are going to get worse next year. So when they have to actually go to the election, so I wouldn't be surprised to see something later on this year.
I think it's going to be really interesting on that one because I think it's a possibility. Because if they go a foot, because if you look at where the rate cut expectations are now in terms of market pricing, we're not talking about a full rate cut being priced in until the towards the end of 2025. So the chances based on market pricing of a rate cut before the next election, which has to be held by sometime in May next year, is looking increasingly unlikely based on that. So there's a real issue. And I think as well, part of the problem is the labor market. It's all well and good for Albo, and this is something that's been confirmed in the media that Labor wants to build its re-election campaign on the idea of rate cuts. But if those rate cuts are coming because inflation, despite the fact inflation is still high, and the labor market is deteriorating, and we're already having this big recession in household, incomes, that's not really a great political position to be in. But I don't know. I kind of get the feeling they're going to be a little bit like Morrison, where he would have been better off going earlier in perhaps late 2021, early 2022, and pulled the trigger then, and maybe he would have had a chance rather than going the full term. But I get the feeling that Albo is going to want to, roll the dice on going the full term and just hope that things sort of work out in a positive way and that the RBA gives him what he needs.
Well, certainly there's no easy calling of an election, and of course the whole energy situation and nuclear will be very much front and center of the of the next fight. But I have to say that there are no easy picks here in terms of when he might go. The short-term impact of those tax cuts and the short-term income improvements because of the other supports, both as state and federal, are there. Of course, that's going to have an impact on the budgets too, particularly state budgets, which are continuing to deteriorate substantially other than in WA. So economically speaking, the foundations are looking a bit shaky. And China, of course, another very important factor, is also looking pretty weak and continually weak. So the economics don't look very positive either way too. So, well, like we said, have we reached Pete Magnus yet, or is there another level still to go?
Well, it's going to be interesting because they got the Communist Party plenum coming up in China next month, in the middle of next month, and I have a feeling that that could be quite instrumental for where things go for Australia from here because you know it's going to potentially set the tone for the level of support for the property sector, for local government, which is going to influence how much they're going to be spending on infrastructure and ergo on Australian steel making commodities. So the question then becomes, how does that play out? Do they continue on, something resembling the current path and sort of try and keep things a little bit more reined in and sort of try and focus a little bit more on the manufacturing and consumer side of the economy? Or do they go back to the bad old days of just trying to support whatever activity they can? And that could be quite instrumental for Australia because, the Chinese property sector as it stands is not going is never going back to what it was before. Chinese demographics have turned. The Chinese perception of real estate has turned, and that's it's never going to go back to those heights. So really, that the infrastructure construction sector of China is really the last remaining engine of China that's supporting Australia. So it's really looking quite precarious in that regard. But by the same token, they could just muddle through and just keep throwing more money at the infrastructure sector for another couple of years at least.
Yeah, I suspect that there'll be quite a lot of muddling through in a number of economies around the place, right? Not wanting to tackle the structural issues that just get through the next few months, which from a political perspective may make some sense, but economically, of course, it's pretty concerning as to how this plays out. And I come back to the growth per capita metric, which I believe is a fundamentally important metric, and it's just worth reflecting on the fact, as you said earlier, in Australia, households are continuing to go backwards simply because we've still got very strong migration. The growth rates are very low. And economically, I just don't see the next round of growth coming through anytime soon. And that's an issue, which, of course, then translates into real problems with people's ability to spend and people's ability to save and to do the normal things that people want to do. And I think this is really, really important because there's a lot of sort of theoretical huff and puff around politics, but actually how it impacts real Australians and people in other countries as well, is a really important thing. And I do believe that politicians are largely disconnected from the real life experience of ordinary people. And it's interesting, Albo is basically saying he wants to make sure that the cost of living support is being pushed out and people understand how much they're doing. I'm not sure they're doing the right things, though.
No, and I think the problem is that we've got this sort of situation where the Albanese government has pursued, what I like to call burnout economics. They've kept their foot hard down on the accelerator to try and prop up the economy, both in the form of high migration and now in the form of, government subsidies, tax cuts, extra spending, etc. To the point where it's now fairly widely acknowledged that their budget is an expansionary, and stimulatory one. But the problem is that what burnout economics has delivered Australians at an individual household level so far is the worst decline in real household disposable incomes on record and a protracted recession in GDP per capita, despite the fact that we've had, increases in volumes of resources exports. So the question then becomes, okay, well, the average household has already taken a bigger hit than they would have taken if we had a recession, because the average household doesn't lose jobs in a recession. It's the outliers that lose jobs. So the question now becomes, are we going to get the unemployment and an even bigger hit to households as the economy now deteriorates and declines, as those support mechanisms like immigration start to get pulled away? Or does immigration just end up like it is in Canada, where they say, oh yeah, yes, we're gonna cut immigration, and you look at the figures and you go, well, no, you haven't. And there's some commentary that for the calendar year 2024 that it could still end up at well over 400,000. So, if that's the case, it's going to be pretty darn hard to get it down to towards 250,000 for the financial year. So it's really just all a bit of a mess. And I think the thing that's really disappointing from just an individual Australian perspective is just that we are the ones who have been forced to pay for it. Albo has got his name in lights, and we have kept out of recession, but everyday Australians have been forced to pay with their hip pocket for that to come to pass. And I think in time they're going to realize that.
Well, they certainly should. Although, of course, Michelle Bullock in front of Parliament the other week said that she didn't think that GDP per capita was actually a particularly important measure, which I thought was quite surprising.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways did that not just sort of give us an idea of uh where the RBA stands, in terms of, I mean, one of their, part of their mandate is the economic prosperity of the Australian people. And if you're not using GDP per capita or something along those lines, like GDP, or like as we mentioned before, real household disposable income per capita as metrics, as quality metrics for measuring how exactly the economy is faring and how the economic prosperity of Australians is faring, then what kind of economic prosperity are the RBA targeting? Is it all just about, is it all just, sort of like the Treasury meme of just number go up in terms of headline GDP? And is that all that matters? Is that how they define economic prosperity? Maybe someone should ask them.
Well, of course, the ABS came out yesterday and said that household wealth has expanded dramatically again, right? So,
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
property's gone up, share prices have gone up, superannuation balances have gone up. So, hey, we're feeling ever so wealthy, except, of course, that it's not equally distributed across all households. And, those without property and those with big mortgages, et cetera, in a completely different situation. It's a very convenient story that you can cherry pick to say everything's fine. But in fact, and I know that in the real world, it's not. But it's madness, isn't it? What do you expect?
Yeah, it kind of hurts my brain, like looking at some of the statistics that show real household consumption for like under 35s at the same level as it was in 2003, 2004. The idea, there's this idea of, young people with their holidays and their trips to Bali and they're so entitled and blah, blah, blah. When in actual fact, their spending has gone nowhere for 20 years, 20 plus years in some cases. And you look at that and you just can't help but think this has never, ever happened before in the history of Australia as an independent nation. Never. Not even during the Great Friggin' Depression has it ever gone back that far for that long. Like we're talking about, sitting there in 1949, 20 years after the Great Depression, and things being the same in terms of consumption. And that is just absolutely absurd. Yet here we are.
Absolutely. Well, talking about where we are, we should get onto the slides or we'll never get to them. So let's go for it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, people, something a little bit new. This charts can now be found at www.burnouteconomics.com. I have a long form report out on the state of the Australian construction sector. It's about 2,500 words, about 20-ish graphs. If you want to become a paid subscriber and get access to that, even if you don't, I'll send a link to Martin for about half of it is in front of the paywall. That would really be very, very much appreciated. And depending on your individual circumstances, that may or may not entitle you to a tax deduction, considering that it's almost end of financial year. So now that I've finished my little spruik, we'll get straight into it. Now, recently, well, not so much recently, since the third, I believe it was since the last quarter of last year, migration into New Zealand has been falling about 28% from where it was. So, and it's come down relatively swiftly in a relatively short period of time. So this is only around about less than nine months worth of data. And lo and behold, Kiwi rents have been flat now for a few months. Kiwi asking rents have now been flat for, I think, 2 or 3 months. And housing prices are rolling over. So I think that we might be able to draw a bit of a hypothesis here, Martin, that high migration pushes up rents and property prices when done at such extreme levels. What do you think?
Shocking revelation. Not.
Yeah.
Well, basic economics, supply demand, right? So you have a lot more people coming into a country and needing somewhere to live. They're either going to the rental sector or they're going to go and buy property. And particularly if some of those migrants bring with them significant cash because of where they were living previously, no surprise that they're competing then for those same properties as the locals, except locals, of course, have less capacity because of what we said earlier on. So absolutely no surprise. So if you take that away, guess what? Property prices begin to normalize and rents don't grow quite as fast. Well. Economics 101.
Yeah, I mean, it'd just be crazy. I mean, can you imagine if we implemented that in Australia? I mean, we could have we could potentially begin to start addressing the rental crisis. I mean, admittedly, our housing deficit's larger than the Kiwis, but we'd have a shot. But I mean, I don't know. That's probably like prejudiced or something. I forget whatever narrative it is of the day.
Well, of course, it's very un-Australian to not want to allow more and more people to flood into the country, despite the fact that it's way more than we've ever done, and despite the fact that we had that negative blip through COVID, but the post-COVID response has been through the roof. We've built less properties, we've built less infrastructure, so everybody, of course, is feeling the pain and the pressure of it. But politically speaking, and I see this all the time, big corporates, whether be they retail, be they construction, be they the banks, they want more people to basically force feed stuff to and to sell stuff to. So, of course, the last thing is that they want to turn the dial down. That would mean they have to probably pay more wages too. And by the way, of course, the tax department like it too, because, of course, the tax goes up. Therefore, Treasury sees the balances rise because we take more tax out of the system. So Treasury likes it too. So unfortunately, there are so many counter forces. But the fact of the matter is that if you really want to fix the housing situation, I think there are three things you need to do. The first is to dial migration down. The second one is to remember that interest rates are now extremely high. Resist any pressure from the banks to dial back the lending criteria because, of course, the banks are now yelling out saying, oh, we can't lend to a lot of people because we can't fit within the parameters, which is, I think, significant. The third one I just highlight quickly is got to deal with the gas situation, the gas price, because the way that the marginal price of electricity comes off gas means that as gas prices continue to rise, the cost of energy in Australia is 5 times what it should be. If you fix those three things, guess what? We'd actually get an economy in better balance and we'd actually get housing in a better balance. But hey, that's too simple, I think.
Well, no, we'd much rather be the Saudi Arabia of gas and have a shortage, and have basically what amounts to a shortage of sand.
Exactly. And why don't we build some extra terminals so that we can re-import the gas that we've exported, thanks to those large international players, at global world prices. So in fact, we now import gas back into Australia at full international prices, which is 5 times what the marginal price should be. I reckon a quick back of an envelope calculation, there's 50 billion a year that we could be generating into the economy if we actually reserved gas and if we actually charge what we should be charging those international players for the access to the gas facilities that they actually have and the capacity that they actually are using. It is nonsensical, and it's one of the biggest reasons why Australian society is suffering at the moment. It's an economic set of decisions taken by governments, lobbied by large international players, and pushing the economy in completely the wrong direction.
So what you're saying is we could have cheap energy for households, cheap energy for high energy businesses that could allow them to compete on a global scale, to create jobs, and to be able to benefit the economy. That's insane, Martin. Why would we want to do that?
Well, we might even have local manufacturing. Can you imagine that?
Oh, something that says made in Australia on it. Wow, I mean, that's crazy talk.
Well, I remind you that I think it was the last plastics manufacturer in Australia just exited simply because the cost of energy was way too high.
Yeah. It's a Saudi shortage of sand. Alrighty. Well, from the shortage of affordable energy to the not to the NDIS, where there is no shortage of additional expenditure. Now, allow me to preface the following by saying that at its core, in principle, the NDIS is a good thing. There are a lot of people who need it, who need help, who were insufficiently looked after prior to the creation of the NDIS. That much is absolutely true, but it has turned into something that is enormous. It was meant to peak at a cost of 1.1% of GDP in the mid 2030s. We're already well past that. It's heading for a cost of over $60 billion by the 2027-2028 financial year, and that's based on the budget projections. Now, if it ends up being higher than the budget projections, as it has been rather consistently for a couple of years now, it's going to get there even faster. But there is a bit of a silver lining for the government, that is. And well, for the government and for the people who are getting these extremely well paid NDIS jobs in a lot of cases without having what a lot of Australians would consider to be adequate qualifications, because the number of healthcare and social assistance jobs has gone from somewhere between 8 and 10% during the early 2010s to in some cases upwards of 18% more recently. And that is also with the enormous expansion in the number of job vacancies. So there is the economy and the labor market are very, very much being supported by this additional NDIS spend and by the employment that it's creating. So you really do have to wonder what the economy would look like without this. And if the NDIS was instead, you know, on a path to a level of spending that is roughly probably less than half of where it's going.
Well, coined the phrase some years ago, the bedpan economy, right? Because what that basically means is that there are more and more people being pulled into the sector of the economy that's actually supporting other people. And I don't have a problem with providing a level of support for those who need it. But if in fact you are inflating the total jobs market in this sector with an economic model that's actually broken in the first place, as that chart shows, you've got to ask some really hard questions. And if it's actually replacing productive growth delivering sectors of the economy, because frankly, if you're just moving money around the place, so you're paying someone to look after somebody, that's important, but it's not actually economically productive. It's a bit like we're just spending more money on building more houses. It's not economically productive. The productive sector of the economy has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And there was some research done quite recently showing just how narrowly based the Australian economy is. So, but again, it's playing the game of large numbers, right? You can say, well, we've got more jobs. Well, most of those jobs are in the bedpan economy, and the productivity and the growth that's produced off that is totally zero.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that you're seeing stories of people earning well over $100,000 as unskilled carers and aides inside the NDIS are not uncommon. And I think the thing is that this is something that you and I have discussed quite extensively on a few occasions now. I think it's very much true that people in aged care, people in disability care, and those sorts of roles have been undervalued for years. And I think it's absolutely true that they deserved to get a level of remuneration that reflects the contribution that they make to our society. And that is well and truly fair. But someone who goes and hangs out with someone who's an NDIS participant who doesn't who doesn't have the care qualifications or isn't providing a level of care consummate with that level of pay, getting paid sort of almost double the average full-time wage is nuts. It's just insane. And and when you get to a point where private equity are becoming some of the major players in a government program, and they're selling toilets and they're selling shower stalls for $120 a pop, when you can probably buy them for about $8 for the exact same thing on AliExpress, you know that there's a problem. And it's just profoundly disappointing that the government isn't fixing this, but it's also not surprising because when you've got something like this that is injecting so much cash into the economy and is providing such a large proportion of jobs growth, it's like an addiction. Because if you take it away, especially at a time when migration is going to be dropping, when people are still feeling very quite dour about the economic circumstances, the economy will face plant. Now it deserves to face plant because we can't keep doing this, but the government doesn't want to have that happen, especially not less than a year before an election.
That's spot on. Mind you, there is a demographic problem too, of course. If you look at the age distribution, we've got more and more people moving into that stage of life when they're going to need more care and more support. So there is a natural shifting going on there. But the results have been amplified because of the way that the economics of the NDIS works. And as you say, people are actually able to rort the system. And I don't mean individuals, I mean that there are corporates now set up specifically to be able to milk the system, to be able to make profits. And it's a bit like the aged care sector, where a lot of aged care is now run by those large corporations who are there for profit. And at the end of the day, I have a real problem when, in fact, it's the profit motive that is driving the mode of care that's actually delivered rather than anything else. And it seems to me that government has misunderstood its role in all of this, which is ultimately governments are there to provide the level of support for those in the community to ensure that they have a reasonable standard of living and those things. I mean, that's not something you can outsource or you can leave to the market to solve, because the market will just take everybody for a ride.
I can't help but thinking about how ironic this is in the sense that if the NDIS was on budget, right, even for the more recent financial year, we could have afforded to raise the rate of job seeker and additionally fix bulk billing and probably still had enough money left over for a new warship for those people at the other end of the political spectrum. Just this year, for God's sake, but what are you going to do, mate? What are you going to do?
What you're going to do is you're going to spend a whole lot of money on AUKUS because, of course, you've got to do that, haven't you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I got to say, it's really just amazing watching, the ongoing wars around the world and seeing the swift evolution of technology, and then looking at, you know, building these submarines that may or may not ever get built, considering the fact that, who knows what's going to happen with the Australian federal budget in time and may end up superseded and obsolete. Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I think that it is an important thing to commit to the defense of Australia, and it is an important thing to fund that.
Hmm.
And I think that for a lot of people who say, well, we should leave AUKUS, we should leave ANZUS, and we should stand on our own, okay. Well, if we're going to do that, we need to increase the defense budget by 60, 70% in order to be able to create a credible deterrent to defend ourselves. But yeah, it just kind of boggles my mind that we're spending so much. I mean, like, realistically, if you look at that from the perspective of, let's say, the Japanese Navy, right? Pick something that's, relatively advanced, well and truly world class, up there with some of the best naval vessels in the world. You could have well over 100 Japanese, top of the line Japanese destroyers for what AUKUS is going to cost us. 100. And you're talking about a top of the line frontline combat unit, right? Now, it just boggles my mind that we're committing to this when we could be, looking at all these different other avenues for, credible defense. And not only that, but there's a scenario in which, the Chinese economy tanks and it becomes a $360 billion white elephant that it basically has no purpose. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting one way or another. Let me put it that way.
And just to round that little point out, the other thing we have to be able to do is to deal with the nuclear waste that it creates. Mind you, of course, if Dutton gets his way with nuclear, we'll have a bigger issue with regard to nuclear waste. Of course, it's only a can-size problem, isn't it?
I've been disappointed with Dutton's plans for the nuclear thing because if we like in the US they're building these new reactors. Bill Gates is funding some of them, and there seems to be a workable business case for them in places, and there's workable businesses case for them around the world. And I think that it's worth having the discussion. But to have the discussion, you need to have a well thought out, credible, and costed plan, which Dutton doesn't have. Instead, we've got what is basically the equivalent of a crayon drawing on the back of a Macca's find a word, and it's just really a bit disappointing because I know a lot of people want to have the nuclear debate, and I'm not anti-nuclear per se. I want to be able to have a reasonable debate about how we're going to, create clean energy for the future, and that's great. But let's actually have the debate by having a plan for it. It's a bit like Dutton's plans to lower immigration. Oh, well, we're going to lower immigration. Okay, how? Well, we're going to lower immigration. Great. Well, we're going to do something student caps. Okay. Well, what about all the bilateral agreements that Morrison signed with India and others that is going to basically keep migration from those places elevated and baked in, and you can't fix that without breaking those agreements or renegotiating them. We're going to talk about that? Are we going to talk about are we going to actually achieve all these things? No, no. We don't do details. We didn't do details on The Voice, so there's no details coming from the left, and there's no details coming from the right. So in the end, the Australian population is just left going, well, I don't know. I'd be happy to discuss a plan if any of you have got one.
Well, it's politics, isn't it? It's pure politics rather than anything else at the moment. And that's the problem, that effectively, just as in the UK through this election cycle, there's a lot of noise and a lot of politics, but some of the really important structural discussions and the detail that you need to have is just not there. Same in Australia at the moment. It's quite convenient when people are effectively not held to account and choose not to go into detail. Of course, once you start putting detail on the table, you can then get questioned and it get pulled apart. So you don't do that.
I think the thing is that we have spent a long time standing on the shoulders of giants. We've been resting on the laurels of our forebears, of leaders and of systems that had the foresight to be prepared for, much higher levels of usage and population, say with infrastructure. Systems that were prepared, for, the onslaught of vested interests to the point that they could. But we're reaching a point now where resting on our laurels is no longer an option. Medicare is falling to bits. Hospital ER outcomes are falling apart. Bulk billing is dying. There's all these, our transport infrastructure cannot keep up with the level of population growth that we're seeing, and that part of that is decades of underinvestment. But you can't undo that, in a matter of years. It's going to take a couple of decades for us to get back to where we were in the 1990s, the early to mid 1990s, and we can't keep resting on our laurels. We need to actually do something and fix things now before they get worse into the future. And to go back to what's going on in the US, they need to fix structural problems with say, for example, the cost of healthcare right now before it ends up sending the country into a fiscal tailspin from which it will not escape. Now, I doubt that they will, and I think they're probably just going to end up eventually just crashing it all into the wall. And however many decades down the road that ends up being. But there are these issues that need to be fixed right here, right now. But at the end of the day, that requires political will, it requires sacrifice, and it requires vested interests to take a hit. And we're not big on that.
Well, it also requires a bit of vision, as we've said on previous shows, looking slightly longer than over the next election horizon and slightly more towards strategically where we want to head as a country. And that's the thing that's the missing at the moment. I would highlight to everybody that the current issues that we are facing are the result of 20 to 30 years of bad policy and policy failure. We should remember that, because it takes that sort of length of time to pull ourselves out, if you can pull out from the nosedive that we're currently in at the moment. Or is it just more convenient to say, well, the ground isn't quite there yet. We've got another, we can drop a little further and we can be a little closer to the ground before we do anything. Just don't look up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the problem is you're just going to have people turn around and go, well, we'd be closer to the ground if the other guys were in power.
Good thought.
Yeah. Okay. We in this chart, which is from my report on the Australian construction sector, we have in the dotted red line at the top is the number of houses that need to be built under the Albanese government's 1.2 million new home completion target. In orange, we have the average recovery from a downturn in dwelling completions over the first 8 quarters from the start of the recovery. Now, the recovery is widely tipped to kick off in Q1 2025, which is basically where this chart is meant to be. Now, if we talk about the ideal super duper best recovery ever and just follow that particular course, we will still come up short of the 240,000 dwelling completions that the Albanese government is targeting. Now, if someone has an economist or a housing industry specialist or someone who actually believes this is going to happen in a credible way, they can please feel free to DM me on Twitter, because I'm literally looking for someone to balance out all the people who say that it's not going to happen. And this isn't like a sort of partisan thing either. This is like people from across the board just telling me that it will not work because it's completely unrealistic. But, I'm trying to offer a little bit of balance here, but there isn't many people willing to go on the record and say that something so absurd is going to actually happen.
Well, 2 observations there. The first is, of course, that the contention between building houses versus public infrastructure has never been higher, because they're spending a lot of money on big projects that are government backed. And if you talk to some people in the construction sector, they think they are actually lower risk of getting involved in those rather than actually building. The second is, of course, that the average duration of completion, in other words, once you finally start to when you end, is blown out like you wouldn't believe, because you can't get the labor and you can't get the parts. And then thirdly, of course, the other side of here is with the big migration, as we discussed earlier on, the demand for property is very, very strong. But I would make the point that the 1.2 million target is, of course, beyond the election horizon. Just bear that in mind.
No, it's actually beyond 2 election horizons. So, they've got plenty of time in terms of, being able to get themselves around that little nugget. But yeah, I think it's just going to be, it's just really just a bit silly, because I think that there's so many different things as well that are not factored into this target. I mean, by some metrics, say from the ABS, in terms of household size, we just purely based on the shrinking of the average household, largely as a result of demographic changes, it added a requirement of almost another 50,000 homes for 2020 for 2023, and that's just silly. I mean, 50,000 homes, and we're only building about 170,000, so almost a third of the homes we're building, you can just go gone. They're just going to be consumed by the fact that household sizes are going to shrink. And then you can take another sort of 15% of those, and you can take those off the table as well, because they're knockdown rebuilds, and they're not adding net dwelling stock. So there's just all these different challenges that are there before we build enough houses, for the even a moderate level of population growth. Yet we're just rushing headlong into, let's just grow the population by 360, 400,000 people a year because reasons, and that's just it. And I think there just needs to be more of a well thought out plan. But this is Australia.
Well thought out plan. How many times have we heard that? And so far from what we actually see. The other quick point, of course, is in terms of taking stuff off the table. I am reminded about the number of projects over the last 20 years that were poorly constructed and are now getting to the point where the costs of trying to fix them up have actually surpassed knocking them down and building them up again. So we're going to create more activity by demolishing recently constructed but poorly constructed properties, which again is completely pointless.
Well, it's the classic Chinese approach. It'll add to GDP.
Exactly. Well, it's activity, isn't it? So it must be good.
Oh, exactly. Broken window fallacy. Now, speaking of the construction sector, this I put together of the average number of square meters of residential living space built per construction worker per year. Now, back in 1986, I chose 1986 for a reason. That was at a time when there was a high level of public infrastructure construction going on. Because a lot of people have rightly said that, that we are seeing the rise of public infrastructure construction crowd out the construction sector. This is true to a degree. However, when you look at it in this particular guise, what you still see is that the productivity of the construction sector in terms of residential living space per worker, it's still gone down significantly. Now, there are a number of different reasons why. There's government regulation, red tape, much of which has unfortunately been extremely ineffective in accomplishing its stated goals, and others is just the decline in ability of management of even down to an individual site level in terms of my discussion with tradesmen and project managers. So yeah, it just doesn't make for pleasant reading, because the problem is that the less efficient the construction sector becomes, the more money it's going to cost to build our house.
Right. And this is in an era where we've got bigger machines, more efficient machines, maybe even more efficient construction processes. So you can't really square that circle, right? It should be more productive, more efficient, unless, of course, we've got lots of overheads and overhangs with regard to regulatory stuff that we didn't have, or maybe working practices are different than perhaps they were. One of the observations, by the way, I saw in Australia is just how specialist the workers are. So, you don't have somebody who can do pretty much everything. You have a specific skill set for plastering and roofing and, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the atomization of the construction sector is probably part of the problem here. But it does show you that there's a really efficiency question which should be being thought about. But I can't see anybody talking about. Of course, the answer is bring in more construction workers from overseas to build more houses for those people who are coming in from overseas. Simple.
Yeah, even though the data shows that construction work, even though it shows that migrants are less likely to be construction workers than the general population. So, sorry, recent migrants. So basically, we're adding more demand for construction workers than we're adding supply, despite the claims to the contrary.
Funny that. And by the way, of course, a proportion of people working in the construction sector in Australia relative to other countries it's off the scale, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I believe it's almost 50% more than in the UK, which is just insane, And yeah, we have a lot of there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed in all of this, because the thing is if you can do something, 20-30% more efficiently, you can get the price down by 10, 15, 20%, which is exactly what we need. Because the problem is you've now got a set of circumstances where the average new house without the land costs almost 5 times the median household income by itself.
Yep.
So we're heading for this really, really interesting impasse, I think, between the property sector and the construction sector, who's generally been quite relatively aligned over the years. Because, of course, it's to get going up. The construction sector, they want work. And if the cost of building a new home just keeps rising and rising and rising and rising, well, eventually they're going to price themselves out of work. And, the cure for high prices is, as they say, high prices.
Oh, and by the way, the borrowing power has dropped dramatically because of the high interest rates, which is going back to my point earlier on about the banks. The banks are saying, oh, well, we can't actually lend to a lot of people because they can't afford to get into property. Duh. The answer is not to actually reduce the lending standards. The answer is to reduce the cost of construction and the cost of property um, relative to income. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward thing. But of course, that would be too logical. So what you do is you reduce lending standards to increase even more risks into the banking system, such that financial stability, which is already extended dramatically because of the high property prices, gets even worse. A little bit more madness there, or just on the side for you.
Well, we seem to have that in spades today. Now, a lot of people have been talking about the reacceleration of Australian inflation, which occurred towards the middle and end of the first quarter of this year, and why. And I think this chart really shows quite nicely why, because the impact of rate rises on the economy is slowly starting to peter out in terms of its additional impact, whereas the impact from population growth continues to grow. So we've got a situation whereby the RBA is taking all this cash out of the economy, but the problem is that migration, in particular migration of working age people, and the growth of that cohort is injecting more than that amount of cash straight back in.
So that means, just to be clear, what it means is that government policy, which is pulling in the opposite direction to what the RBA is doing, is going to force the RBA to go higher on rates to try and actually counteract what the government is actually doing in terms of its own policies.
Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, the big question is whether or not the RBA ends up doing its job.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, the thing is that, and not only that, but all this is before they've pulled the trigger on all the subsidies and the tax cuts and everything else. So, if that does get spent into the economy, we really do potentially face a stagflationary scenario where migration stays relatively high, where that ends up, putting upward pressure on unemployment, yet inflation remains relatively entrenched at an uncomfortably high level. So, well, I mean, I wouldn't be wanting, let me put it this way, I wouldn't want to take that to an election if I were Aldo, but here we are.
Right. And just to underscore two things. The first is that the whole concept of burnout economics, as we've discussed previously, is you've got your foot on both the accelerator and the brake at the same time, and so you create a lot of smoke and a lot of sort of noise, but you don't actually make much progress, right? And I always argue that the smoke and noise is what we're seeing at the moment. But the second point is this: that the consequence of that new flood of additional stimulus, which Chalmers claimed was actually not going to actually increase inflation, will in fact increase the momentum with regard to inflation. And a lot of the inflationary pressure that we're seeing in Australia is homegrown. Inflation is much more sticky and homegrown in Australia than it is in many other places at the moment. So we're already starting from a bad position. And there's another significant injection of liquidity coming in, which is going to increase that burnout even more.
Yeah, and like anyone who's ever done burnout comps or really thrown the kitchen sink at it with their mates, the problem with burnouts is eventually you break something.
Exactly. Yes. Is it the tires that burn out, or is it the other momentum in the vehicle? I don't know. But again, I just a little more flavour of madness. This common theme that we're going to see. We are blessed with so much madness.
Uh, there's this discussion, that Europe, the open air museum, it's all about, the public it's all about the public sector and blah, 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 blah. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of that criticism is, fairly decently founded. But one thing that I thought was interesting recently when I was going through these charts was that private consumption expenditure in Australia is now lower as a percentage of GDP than it is in Europe. Now that to me is really, really quite funny, because we're meant to be this powerful free market economy when really, when you look at it, we're increasingly held up by the public sector jobs growth, public sector spending, things like the NDIS and others. And, we're not really the vibrant free market economy that our leaders really claim that we are.
But going back to my earlier ABS statistic, if you take the total household wealth and divide it by the number of people in the country, per capita basis, we actually come out quite a lot higher than many European countries because, of course, the house price thing has just gone through the roof. Completely artificial, of course. This chart here that you've got makes a much more telling point that, in fact, what is true is that in real terms, we are now performing pretty badly.
Well, I think this is quite interesting in a way because it's sort of like this perpetual motion machine whereby the government pumps up asset prices rise, people spend, and well, it's not so much people spend, the government spends. So it just ends up at this giant crap perpetual motion machine that is basically just powered by the misery of everyone who just wants a roof over their head.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting, of course, because, the idea of a perpetual motion machine is quite interesting. So if you put a generator and an engine together, in theory, with complete efficiency, you'd be able to whiz it up and then it should actually maintain. But of course, it doesn't because of the atrophy in the system, right? Well, I would argue that the economy is in the same boat. The atrophy in the system at the moment is actually the households and what's going on with many households. Not all households, some are doing quite well and are feeling extremely affluent and buying more investment properties, but the vast majority of households now are actually in a very, very different position and are really feeling it. I see it in my stress data and other things too. But politically, they can say, well, we're pumping the economy and, the numbers are going up, the speedometer is saying everything's fine. But of course, the reality is it's not.
Well, it actually fits quite nicely with the burnout economics analogy because the speedo says you're doing 100 k's now, but you look outside and you go, oh, oh crap! There's loads of smoke everywhere. The wheels are going really fast, but I'm not actually going anywhere.
Yes, exactly right. And in fact, you get so much smoke you can't even see where you are going in the first place, which might also extend the analogy slightly further.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, if you can't see anything, you can't vote against it, can you? I mean, that's an election winning strategy right there.
Spot on.
Okay, now this is of the ABS monthly inflation, and well, as you can see, it bottomed out in terms of the annual trend mean in Q1, a little bit earlier in terms of the monthly CPI. But yeah, it's not really that good of a looking that good looking of a chart because if you once you look at the partials as well, you left asking yourself where is the next leg down in inflation going to come from? And I think that's a pretty important and challenging question for the Aussie economy.
Yeah, and as we've said, of course, the government will be able to claim that the incentives that they've thrown into the economy, the cash relief, et cetera, will actually take the edge off inflation at a superficial level. We actually saw that through the electricity subsidies last year, right, and the rent subsidies, which did take the numbers down. But of course, as soon as you take it away, it comes back again, and so that's the problem. The other point there is that the energy spike was much stronger than people expected, and the latest estimates are now that the gas price will continue to rise, partly because of some of the Middle East situation, and partly because we're starting to move into the northern winter, which will put perhaps more demand. And there are now concerns that, in fact, the energy mix and supply in Australia is at risk. All of those things would suggest that the inflationary pressures are likely to remain quite strong. And by the way, the international transport costs are also quite a lot stronger than they were. So, yeah, where is the next leg down? We have the goods adjustments, but the services is very strong, and wages growth is still there as well. So, yeah, I think this inflationary story has got another at least 2 to 3 years to run probably through.
It's a bit of a mess, yeah. And I mean, for a start, as we mentioned previously, there's the issue with the subsidies distorting things and pushing inflation into 2025. But as you say, there's also the goods inflation side of things as well. If the issues in the Red Sea continue, you're starting to see, if you look at the charts for individual shipping routes. Now, obviously, Europe was the one that got hit hardest first, and then you saw it spread into North America, into the Middle East, and now you're starting to see it in Southeast Asia, despite of the obvious fact that Southeast Asia is rather proximate to China. Yet
It's
you're still seeing shipping costs rise dramatically. So far, Australia has been relatively insulated, but that's not going to last forever. So it's going to be rather interesting in that regard. Particularly if we do start to see something of an inventory build cycle here, but I think that maybe perhaps that might be, sort of postponed by the cost. But the thing is, the very things that have been driving inflation down, things like household goods, things like, for example, the drop in the cost of some building materials, or at the very least, the leveling out of the cost of building materials, that could potentially, stop or even reverse, which could create some rather serious problems for the RBA. Both, and I think it's worth noting this is not something that's going to happen quickly. It's never been
yeah,
something that's. It's an extremely complex and large system that with large lags. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for the best part of 6, 7, 8 months now. Yet the thing is, we've now seen it come to pass for others. In the US, they're probably about, let's call it 6 months away from seeing it in their good CPI, and we're probably a bit longer. But that's going to come at a really bad time for the RBA for when all those subsidies expire. And then it's like, hey, have some goods inflation as well.
yeah, absolutely. Well, that's why I've of the view that the RBA will be forced to do something that it doesn't want to do. Probably it's a question of when. How long will they hope that things will actually sort of muddle through? Wait for more data, of course. It will, oh, we won't rule anything in, we won't rule anything out. We'll wait for more data, but at some point they're going to have to probably bite the bullet. And the externalities aren't looking particularly flash over the next few months either. So we may well see. And it's interesting, even in Canada, of course, where they cut rates, then they had a bit of a shock with their inflation report, right? We've got issues in New Zealand where inflation is still significantly higher and more sticky than where it was expected to be. In the UK, we've got somewhat similar things going on as well. And even in the Eurozone, there's more data coming soon. Some of the most recent CPI data was stronger than expected as well. So, yeah, this is going to take time to play out.
Well, I think you're saying about the RBA and the issues that they have in terms of making a decision. I think this slide is a really good place to end today's discussion on, because there is a risk that the AB, and this is something that is an issue that prominent economists have shared. This isn't just sort of like a casual tinfoil hat theory, that the labour market is actually deteriorating more rapidly than the ABS labour market data would suggest, and that it will deteriorate fairly significantly from here. Now, how quickly that occurs and when is obviously an open question. But I think that you've probably got the RBA sitting there looking at charts like this and similar ones from from Seek, or from based on the ABS job vacancies data, and they'd be thinking the labour market could blow up in our faces. So what are we going to do? Are we going to raise rates because inflation is sticky, and we're increasingly finding a hard time pointing out where exactly this next leg down in inflation is going to come from? Or are we going to sit on our hands because we're really concerned about the labor market blowing up in our face, particularly given the rather politically charged nature of the next sort of 12 months with the election, and really any move is going to be a challenging one regardless.
Right, and just on that, the ABS labour statistics are full of holes. It's not just in Australia, but specifically in Australia. So, it's been surprising, some of the moves, and that's something to do with sampling, something to do with the way that the surveys run. It's also the definition of employed or unemployed, which is part of the problem. But the other indicators have actually been going soft for quite some time. And of course, the RBA is quite anxious to try and maintain the employment rate as high as possible and the unemployment rate as low as possible as part of its mandate as well. So that is definitely something they're going to be going to be watching. The trouble is that at some point these things are going to come home, and I think the other observation is that sometimes the unemployment moves quite quickly. So things start to move quite quickly. So it could well be that we've already got a latent problem. It's just not exposed through the ABS methodology, and it may be some months before we see it.
Yeah, that's my concern. I mean, I read a similar article to that earlier on in the year, basically just saying, is the labor market and the economy going to hit a wall? And it's quite possible that it already has, and that we're just going to see these enormous revisions down the road. And I think it's just worth noting that if you actually compare the ABS data to the US data, like say for example, like there have been recent reports where it's like, well, we created 60,000 jobs. That's the equivalent of creating over 700,000 jobs in the US. Now you do not see now they get, the Bureau of Labor Statistics gets crap when they're off by 100K. Now, when you're seeing swings in Australia of what in the US would be over 500,000 jobs a month, that's huge. Yet, you know, yet by the same token, this is literally the indicator that is make or break for the RBA. Because I mean, if that indicator spits out a number that says we lost 60,000 jobs this month, they're going to be cutting rates because then they're not going to care that it's the trim mean is 4.4% year on year. They're going to be going, oh crap, the labor market is blowing up in our faces as we speak. So I think that that's really the big problem here going forward. They've got these two things to balance, and let's be honest, the quality of both of them is not fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the point. The linkages between what's happening in the real world and the indicators on the board, as it were, are pretty shaky. And so you're trying to steer this ship with all those lags and with all that latency that's in the system. So it's quite hard to do. It's a bit like trying to land, one of those games where you're trying to land a spacecraft on the moon or something, and you're sort of trying to pull all the levers and trying to. It's very hard because there's a bit of sort of ifs and buts and what have you, right? Well, I think that's what the RBA is trying to do with its modelling. And the trouble is, I actually think that they've probably got too much confidence in their models in the first place, their own models. But the input data that's coming in is also very, very laggy and very, very suspect as well. And we get lots of revisions and lots of people, seeing different variations as things move around. So it's quite hard to try and land this ship. And frankly, the longer it goes on, the less likely that I see a soft landing. And it's more likely that it's going to be pretty uncomfortable. In fact, I was listening to the ABC and somebody was saying, well, we were actually moving from a narrow path to a tightrope. I think that's probably a good way to summarize it.
Well, we're not only going from a narrow path to a tightrope, we're now trying to land a spaceship on the tightrope. So I think that's probably even more challenging again.
Yeah. Tarric, I got to say, really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, it's a pretty serious situation we're in, but to be able to go around and explore all of these dimensions and to highlight some of the madness, and also to highlight some of the gaps between what the politics is saying and what the reality is saying in terms of the data is great. And I will look forward to doing it again when we can, and refer everybody back to your new website and go get the full report and learn more about burnout economics.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Well, you got to have a laugh, innit?
Absolutely. Without a laugh, things get too serious. Thank you. We'll see you again soon.
Catch you later.